After a year of traveling abroad and lecturing, Nehemiah Gordon came to Charlotte to spend some time, and the very first evening, we got into a topic that I said, I really need you to dig into the book of Acts with me because there's something that needs to be explained as only a former Pharisee could even understand these particular things. And so I invited Nehemiah Gordon back, and we're finally getting around to the first half-hour discussion that we had right. in that 5-hour night. And it's concerning the book of Acts.
Yeah.
And so I'll lay out the foundation here. Yeah. It is the believers are in Antioch. Paul and Barnabas are there. They're just returning from Lystra, where Paul was stoned. Luke is up there. He has been a part of the synagogue up there. And these believers are, they speak, and Aramaic is the language spoken in that area. And so we have a number of believers that came from Judea, and they are all up there because of the number of Gentiles who are coming to faith, and they started in the synagogue, in the Jewish synagogue, and so these Gentiles, these Greeks are coming to faith. But now we have, and I'll read this out of the chronological Gospels. This is the book of Acts, chapter 15, verse 1. Certain men came down from Judea and taught the brothers, saying, unless you're circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. And so after Paul and Barnabas had a great dissension, there's a big argument with them, then they decided that certain of them would go down to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders and ask them this question. And it says, then certain spokesmen of the sect of the Pharisees, which believed, these are believers who were raised as Pharisees, and they're now believers, and they stood up and said that it was necessary to circumcise the Gentiles and command them to keep the law of Moses. And so, Nehemiah, this is going to take us all the way through into 15 and other parts, but from your perspective as a former Pharisee, you're raised as a Pharisee, your father's rabbi, you're going back generations of Pharisee rabbis, and so what is this saying to you? These believers who are Pharisees then making these assertions to the believers up in Antioch.
Well, so Michael, when I first read this years and years and years ago, it was obvious what they were saying, that if you want to be part of God's covenant, in other words, if you want to be part of God's covenant, first you have to be Jewish. You have to convert to Judaism in a formal way, and the way that rabbinical Judaism and honestly even Karaite Jews generally will teach the same thing, even though it's not biblical, and this is where I part ways from many Karaites. What they'll teach is that to be a Jew, you have to formally be accepted. You have to appear before a council of rabbis, for a Beit Din, and you have to get their stamp of approval to be part of the people of Israel. And you could say you're an Israelite, you could accept the God of Israel and the people of Israel and be circumcised till you're blue in the face, but unless you get that stamp of approval from this official body of rabbis, you will not be accepted in their mind as a Jew. And it's interesting, I'm just thinking as I'm talking about this, that if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are some Christian denominations where you could go to a body of water and accept Jesus and be baptized, but they won't consider you a true Christian unless they baptize you.
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
You have to be rebaptized again into their denomination.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So even if you were baptized by another denomination, you have to be baptized into their denomination, you're saying?
That's
okay.
right.
I was talking about if you baptize yourself, so to speak. And you're saying something even more than what I realized. Wow. So the point is that these Pharisees had a very similar concept. It doesn't matter what you do, what you believe. The only thing that matters is, number one, your lineage. If you were born a Jew to a Jewish family, then you're Jewish. Or if you weren't, then you must go through their authority to convert. And the problem that happened in the time of the Roman Empire, and I remember learning this decades ago at Hebrew University when I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology, is that you had a large population in the Roman Empire who are referred to in Jewish sources as God-fearers. God-fearers were people who wanted to be Jewish, but there was something keeping them back from undergoing this formal process. And one of the major things that would stop any adult male from undergoing the formal process, both then and quite frankly, even today in some places, is the act of physical circumcision. You know, Michael, a few years back, I was reading this medieval Jewish text, and it was the opinion of this one Jewish author that if you're a Cohen, a descendant from Aaron, that you're not allowed to be present in the room when an 8-day-old boy is being circumcised. And you might ask, well, why? Well, why would a Kohen not be allowed to be in the room? And the answer was obvious in these sources. According to the Torah, a Kohen becomes ritually unclean if he's in the same room as a dead body. Mm-hmm. And circumcision was so dangerous that even an 8-day-old boy could die. It didn't happen all the time, but it did happen that, especially back then when infant mortality was very, very high. And then, 200 years ago in the Western world and still today in some parts of the world. I mean, go to Haiti and their infant mortality we should be ashamed in the Western world of what babies die all the time just because they're young and weak. And so the point was, if a baby would die from being circumcised on the 8th day, then boy, is that dangerous for an adult. And I had a friend in Israel who wasn't Jewish, but believed in Yeshua and wanted to keep Torah, and he wanted to be circumcised. He just felt in his heart he wanted to be circumcised, and many American men are already circumcised. He wasn't American. He was from South Africa. And so he asked me, will you inquire where I can get circumcised? And I went and I asked around, and I found out, and I even contacted the Moel, the circumciser that my sisters use. My sisters, between them, I've lost count how many nephews, a whole bunch of nephews, and all of them use the same man to circumcise their sons because he's the guy in Jerusalem, the go-to guy. He's just the expert. The guy does 3 or 4 circumcisions a day. He is a perfect record. He's considered one of the most skilled people in Israel. So I went and I asked this guy. He said, nobody does circumcision in Israel for an adult outside of a hospital. I said, why a hospital? He said, it's dangerous for an adult. In a way, it's much more dangerous for an adult than for an 8-day-old baby. And there could be complications. And if there's hemorrhaging, guys, I hate to be graphic about this, but this is the reality of what we're talking about, that there's actual physical dangers to being circumcised as an adult. Now go back in time 2,000 years to the Roman Empire, where we're dealing with rusty knives, and you have probably over 1 million, possibly 2 or 3 million people in the Roman Empire who are a minority, but they're a large enough minority to where they're noticed in Jewish sources, and they're clearly a contingent in the synagogues, where they're known as the God-fearers, and they want to be part of Israel. But the main barrier keeping them back is this physical circumcision. You had some man who'd say, well, I'm 45 years old, this will kill me, right? So I can't be part of Israel, I can't be part of God's covenant. This is what they were being told by the rabbis, and quite frankly, what they would be told today by the rabbis. This is not some obscure doctrine, right? This is just fact in the Jewish world. And in some ways, it's a great analogy or a great parallel to what you described as someone who's baptized in one denomination has to be rebaptized in another. Because guess what, Michael? And this is obvious to anybody in the Jewish world, but let's say in America, you have most men who are actually circumcised by doctors in the hospitals, or at least in earlier generations were. If one of those people goes to a rabbi, one of those men, and says, I want to convert to Judaism, but I'm already circumcised, the rabbi is going to require him to undergo a recircumcision. And that will, I don't want to get graphic here, but there's blood involved. And the question is why? The person's already circumcised, yeah, but not under the authority of the rabbis.
Right.
So I think that's a lot of what they're talking about. That's my take. When I read this years ago in Acts, my understanding was, okay, you have a bunch of God-fearers in the synagogues who are hearing Paul preach, and they're like, oh, okay, we actually believe in the Messiah that you're talking about, and we've been kept at the door. We're in the back of the synagogue being treated as second-class citizens because we're not Jewish, and we have this barrier to us becoming Jewish, and we can't be accepted by other Jews until we're circumcised. And Paul is saying, you know what? You don't have to be circumcised to come into God's covenant. And I think that's the key passage here in Acts 15. It appears in 3 places, Acts 15, 20, 29, and then in Acts 21 that we'll get to hopefully. And the point there is that you have these people who there's, and this is my take on it, okay? And this is after encountering many people they'd come to Israel. A lot of them are it's interesting because they're coming from a New Testament perspective, and they say, Nehemiah, I've been going to my Messianic congregation for years, and they won't let me be a member because I'm not Jewish. And I've heard, you know how many times I've heard this? Many times.
Yeah.
They're not officially a member because they're not Jewish. They're treated as a second-class citizen. And boy, what an amazing parallel to the non-Messianic synagogues in the first century, or maybe even what's happening in Acts 15 with the Pharisees who are believers, that if they're not Jewish, they're not a full-fledged member of that congregation, and they're somehow considered different and separate. And they come to me and they say, Nehemiah, I want to be circumcised. And I'm like, hey, first of all, guys, don't look at me. I have no skills. I have 2 left thumbs. Just walk away. And,
While you can.
Well, what's that?
While you can.
Yeah, while you can. Exactly. And I've consulted, circumcisers for them and doctors, and I'm told, hey, look, this can only be done in a hospital, and it's very dangerous, and it has to be done under proper supervision, right? A baby, you can do that in someone's living room. I was circumcised in my parents' living room in Chicago, in West Rogers Park, and
we've done it in our lobby here.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
not me.
But to babies, I'm assuming, right? Oh, okay. Yeah. But to adults, as a rule, at least in Israel, which is the world's experts on circumcision of adults, it's only done in hospitals because there's a danger involved. And so imagine in the first century where there's really no concept of medicine, there's really no concept of hygiene, and these people are being told, sorry guys, you can be part of our congregation for 30 years, and now you can even believe in Yeshua, but you can't be part of this body. You're part of some other separate body. This is what they were.
Associate members.
Associate members is actually the term they use in some of these Messianic synagogues, right?
That's right. That's right.
So they're being treated as second-class citizens. I think this is what Paul talks about when he refers to the one new man, right? Meaning there's this, he's not saying there's no such thing as a Jew and no such thing as a Gentile, but when you're joining together, meaning the concept these Pharisees had was that first you become a Jew, and then you can become a Messianic Jew who believes in Yeshua. But first you have to be a Jew, and the way to become a Jew is to undergo the circumcision. Well, so here's my take on this, Michael, and this will not be popular in the rabbinical world. It won't be popular in the Karaite world, but my take on it is when I look at this, to me, it's the story of Abraham and the Israelites in the desert. The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. They'd heard God speak at Mount Sinai with their own ears. And they're wandering for 40 years in the desert, and we come to find out suddenly in the book of Joshua that these guys were all uncircumcised.
All right.
40 years they're wandering in the desert, and they're not circumcised. And why weren't they circumcised? Because they were traveling, and it was dangerous. They never knew if 5 minutes from now or the next morning, if the cloud would rise and they would have to follow, and all the circumcised men or even babies couldn't travel. When you're I don't want to be graphic here, but when you're circumcised, there's a recovery period. We know that from the story of Shechem and Dinah and the daughters, Shimon and Levi there in Genesis. But the point is, so for 40 years in the desert, they said, okay, we got to wait until we can come to the promised land and be in a situation where there's no traveling involved, where there's time for recovery, and it might only be a few days. But in the desert, they never knew that they had a few days, because at any moment the cloud could rise. So they said, we're going to wait. And then when they enter the land, then it was the right time, and then they were circumcised. And then we have the story of Abraham. He comes into the land. He's called out of Haran when he's 75 years old. And he's not, that's in Genesis 12. And it's not till Genesis 17, when he's 99 years old, 24 years later, that he's given the commandment of circumcision. So for 24 years, Abraham is walking with God. He's Avram at the time, right? He's not Avraham yet. He's Avram. He's walking with God. He's in fellowship with God. He's in covenant, but not the covenant of circumcision because he's not ready. Because God could have said to him at any time, and it's interesting, what did he say to him? Go, lech lecha me'artzecha, go for yourself from the land of your birth and of your fathers to where I will show you. So Abraham was like the Israelites in the desert. He never knew when the next situation was where he would have to get up and go. God knew. God could have said, hey, Abraham, I've got this thing for you, circumcision. you're going to be here for 3 weeks recovering. Don't worry. Do what I say. Do the circumcision. But instead, God said, you know what? My servant Abraham isn't ripe for circumcision quite yet. And I still love him. And I'm still in covenant with him. And I'm still walking with him. And then I put myself, and I'm trying to have some empathy here, Michael. It's easy for me to say, everybody go out there and get circumcised. That's real easy for me because I did it when I was 8 days old. And I'm told by my mother that I pissed in the Moel's face. I got him. That'll teach him. But the point is, I didn't know what was going on. I was an 8-day-old baby, and it just happened to me. And, it's just a fact. But for an adult, even today, it's not a trivial thing. It's actually a really big deal. And I think that's the key to understanding Acts 15, and especially when you read what they said there, which I hope we'll have time to get to. I think the point there was these Pharisees were saying, oh, no, those people, they're associate members. They can't be part of our body. They can believe in Yeshua all they want, but they can't really be part of it till they first pass in through our authority and become Jews, and then they can be part of this congregation, of this group of believing in Yeshua. And even James rejects that, right? Even James says, no, that it's not just Paul, because sometimes people say, oh, that's Paul, he did away with the law. James is saying this. So can we read what James says for the Gentiles?
Let's set the context a little bit with Peter back here, because this is years after Peter was sent to Caesarea, the household of Cornelius. These were God-fearers, according to the standard at the time. They're praying to God 3 times a day, and when Cornelius was told to send his soldiers down and to find Peter and have him speak, while Peter was yet speaking to him, it says that they all spoke in tongues just like they had on the day of Pentecost. So Peter said, who is I to withstand God? He would have baptized or mikvahed these Gentiles, because they hadn't gone through this process, being accepted as Jews. But yet they saw that God had worked in these Gentiles already. And so when you've got others, Pharisees, who are believers, who are saying, no, they're not really saved. They can't be saved unless they do that. Okay, now we're going to get, Barnabas and Paul are going to come down to Jerusalem, and there's going to be a cat fight here, and James is going to have to step in on this.
And I want to try to, as much as I can, stay out of Christian theology, right? Because to be saved and what all that means, I'm Jewish. I want, I got to stay out of that, right?
Okay.
People can work that out for themselves in the New Testament, fear and trembling with prayer and study, which I believe in general. But I'm just thinking as you're describing this, the Pharisees are saying they can't be saved, and the meaning of the name Yeshua is Yehovah Yoshia, Yehovah saves. That's the meaning of his name. He bears that name, the name Yehovah Yoshia. Yehovah is the one who saves. And what the Pharisees are really saying is because these people are not circumcised and haven't gone through the hoops that we've set up for them to jump through, they can't have any part in Yeshua in this salvation, in this Yehovah Yoshia salvation. Because first they need to be Jews, and then they can get saved as Jews. So I think that's really an interesting image there. And then what we have in Acts 15 in response to that attitude is what's called the Jerusalem Council, right? So it's referred to as today. And there's a lot of different views about what that is.